Things have been getting a bit tense between Israel and Iran of late, haven't they? What with the fiery rhetoric, proxy wars, bombing of each other's territory, and all that stuff. Despite the ever-worsening tension, however, we in the Western world hold a certain solace from how our zeitgeist views the situation. Because, and let's not beat about the bush here, we have a habit of viewing Iran as something of a joke country, one that loves to beat its chest and throw out all manner of hot air, but that ultimately has a bark far more fearsome than its bite, and would inevitably get steamrolled should a proper shooting war ever break out. But what if we were to tell you that we think such a view might just be misguided, and that in reality, Iran could well surprise us all with the performance of its military? If that claim got you interested, don't go anywhere, because in the next 20 or so minutes, we're going to explain our thinking. The videos on this channel take a lot of research, because wars are rarely black and white. They involve deep layers of political, historical, and social factors that are impossible to understand from a single source. And most of what you see on social media and even in the news is filtered through ideological biases and skewed facts to fit an agenda. But today's sponsor, Ground News, is a brilliant app and website that exposes these biases so you aren't swayed by them. Take the tragic shooting at the West Bank Jordan border, for example. It's been covered by hundreds of sources, of which nearly 70% are considered highly credible, meaning their reporting tends to be more objective than subjective. This is critical to look out for, especially when it comes to war. News can be full of propaganda to sway public perception, influencing how you vote and the endless protests we've seen around the world. From here, you could scroll through the world's reaction to this shooting. Israeli-based J-Post believes the threat to their nation goes beyond Gaza, as Jordan has a history of smuggling weapons and drugs to the West Bank. Check out this news. These are very different perspectives, approaching the same story with unique historical context that a single article could never provide. And here's what makes Ground News so great. They don't tell you what to think. They just show you how stories are told from every angle so you can make up your own mind about it. So, I highly recommend following the Israel-Hamas war there. I think what Ground News is doing is essential, especially in times of conflict. So go to ground.news/warographics or scan the QR code now for a massive discount on their unlimited access Vantage plan. They're independent, subscriber funded, but you guys can save 40% on all these amazing features. Big thanks to Ground News for sponsoring this video, and now back to it. All right, so the one thing that we have to be really clear about before we get into the real meat of today's episode is that what we say today should not be taken as a bold declaration of objective truth, and instead should be considered as a hopefully informed guesstimate, because unfortunately there is simply just so much about the Iranian military that we don't know and just likely never will. Now, make no mistake, some legitimately incredible and insightful data does indeed exist in the Western world, but it's all very much behind locked, closed doors, wrapped up in layer after layer of security clearance, and thus is accessible only to the people who have the power to actually affect the course of geopolitics, not YouTube pundits, no matter how enthusiastic we might be. Now, this leaves us dependent on so-called open source intelligence, i.e. information that is publicly available, and that, of course, in itself creates a hurdle, as oftentimes such data, although nearly always curated and distributed with a real care and attention to detail, is incredibly inconsistent, with different outlets having radically different approaches to data collection, and thus often sharply disagreeing on the reality of the matter as a result. For example, the International Institute of Strategic Studies, or IISS, and the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, two very respected names in the open source intelligence world, completely disagree on the Iranian military budget, with the former giving figures for a tasty $44 billion in 2023, and the latter giving it a mere $10.3 billion. So you could probably see the problem. Those are big differences. Because how are we meant to choose our sources for this video when ultimately we don't have a bloody clue who is putting out the best data and analysis? Well, for what it's worth, our approach was a simple one: to DM someone we know who's in the biz, as it were, and ask them to choose our sources for us, and they recommended two particular sources: The Changing Trends in Gulf Military and Security Forces, a net assessment by Anthony Cordesman, and The Military Balance, the annual assessment of global military capabilities and defense economics, as published annually by the IISS. So, they shall be our linchpin sources for today's video. So, with that said, let's crack on, shall we, and start laying out our arguments. Now, the first thing to note is that the Iranian military is big. It's made up of 610,000 personnel across all branches. That makes it the largest military across the Middle East and North Africa, followed by Egypt and Saudi Arabia, who have 438,500 and 257,000 respectively. Further still, however, that figure also makes the Iranian military one of the biggest on Earth, period, with it coming 8th overall. As for how Israel stacks up against that, it only has the 6th largest military in the region, thanks to its 169,500 soldiers, with 4th and 5th positions being taken by Morocco and Iraq, which have 195,000 and 193,000 respectively. Now, from that simple fact alone, you can already start to wrap your head around what we mean when we say that the Iranian military shouldn't be underestimated. Sure, there's a lot of other factors to consider if one wishes for a full and true understanding of the situation, and don't worry, we're going to be getting to those soon enough, but just off the raw numbers alone, it wouldn't exactly be an easy fight for Israel, would it? Let's stay with that 610,000 figure for a while longer and zoom the microscope in a bit further, however, because the Iranian military, despite its vast size, isn't exactly what you'd call normal in its composition, as its capabilities revolve around two main juxtaposed pillars, those being a conventional military, i.e. one that's organized, trained, and equipped to conduct traditional forms of warfare, including ground, air, and naval operations against similarly structured military forces, and one which is all about so-called asymmetric warfare, i.e. unconventional tactics that one employs when at a disadvantage conventionally, with examples being guerrilla warfare, terror attacks, and hit-and-run ambushes. Though seemingly diametrically opposed at face value, both approaches and the units that operate them are actually intended to work in perfect synergy with one another, maximizing Iran's ability to defend itself and project power by making sure that there is no threat that it cannot respond to and no action it cannot take, theoretically at least. As for who does the conventional stuff, that would be the Iranian army, or Artesh as it's called in Persian. Quite confusingly, despite the word army naturally leading one to assume a focus on land-based operations, the Artesh is actually the centralized general command for Iran's conventional forces. Things only get a bit more confusing when we look at the branches that it commands too, as making up the Artesh are the ground forces, i.e. the actual army, the Air Force, the Navy, but also the Air Defense Force, which, just like it says on the tin, is a branch dedicated entirely to anti-aircraft warfare. They used to be a part of the Air Force, but was split off in 2008. Don't worry too much about it, just know that that's how the Iranians do it. Then there's the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or IRGC, a force that is totally separate from Artesh. They do some conventional stuff, but their real raison d'etre is that asymmetric warfare that we just talked about, with them having a near total monopoly on its execution. They were originally formed in 1979 in the wake of the Iranian Revolution and started out essentially just as a secret police force with a specific charge of guarding the Ayatollahs from counter-terror revolution, hence the name. As time went on, they started taking on more and more paramilitary duties as and when something came up that the Artesh couldn't handle, and now, after over 40 years of that, they've evolved into a full parallel military force that has its own ground, naval, and aerial assets and spans the military, economic, and political spheres. Their army, the IRGC ground forces, leverages light infantry, mechanized units, and a lot of different flavors of rocket and missile-armed troops, and with them can conduct operations of differing intensity depending upon the geopolitical demands of any given time. Everything from assassinations, guerrilla warfare behind enemy lines, all the way through to full-scale conventional warfare should a desperate situation call for it. Their Navy, the IRGC Navy, operates along similar lines, just on the wet stuff. It operates predominantly in the Persian Gulf, but has the capability to go further out should it be required, and makes extensive use of small, nimble, and fast attack craft and mini-submarines, with one of their linchpin tactics being to deploy in swarms in order to harass and overwhelm larger conventional naval forces. Further to that, they can also deploy a dizzying array of naval mines and anti-ship missiles, with it generally being assumed that should a shooting war ever break out, their day one job would be to make, or at least try to make, the Strait of Hormuz completely inaccessible to enemy traffic. And speaking of missile capabilities, that's something that the IRGC Air Force really goes to town on, with them having access to surface-to-air missile systems such as the indigenous Khordad-15 and Russian S-300 and S-400 systems, as well as much of its short and medium-range ballistic missile arsenal such as the Fateh-110 and Shahab-3. As for how many such missiles they have, fuck knows, to be honest. But given that they use them reasonably regularly in both test firings and military exercises, it certainly doesn't appear as though they've pumped out just a handful for the sake of intimidating Uncle Sam. So between what we've just discussed and the earlier mention of the Air Defense Force being its own separate thing, you may have gotten the impression that missiles are kind of Iran's shtick, and you'd be absolutely right to think so, as Tehran has really prioritized getting them right. But there's far more to them than just being something they're particularly fond of, and instead, they form part of a much wider story, one in which Iran has taken a very pragmatic view of its defense and to sort out technologically doable and cost-effective solutions to maximize its military capabilities. When it comes to missiles, the logic that saw Iran prioritize them is twofold. Firstly, that it gives them an ability to strike foreign lands without deploying conventional ground forces, which are expensive and come with logistical difficulties, and secondly, that it gives them an ability to at least try and keep control of their skies if a proper war kicks off, because while an Israeli F-35 would argue potentially the greatest plane currently in the skies, comes with both an economic and technological barrier to entry that Iran will likely never be able to traverse, filling the skies with so many missiles that said F-35 can never penetrate Iranian airspace, well, that's an idea that might actually just work. And it's the same with the IRGC. They're a piece of blue sky thinking designed to make Goliath think twice about raising his fists to David. This idea carries on with the next good thing that we're going to have a look at: unmanned aerial vehicles, or UAVs, which, thanks to their semi-regular appearance on breaking news pieces, you may already be familiar with. In short, Iran has developed a wide range of drones for various purposes, and we mean a lot. It has kamikaze models, such as the tiny little Mirage 521 that carries a mere 3 kilos of explosives, through to the beefy Arash series that packs 150 kilos worth. There's also reconnaissance models, such as the Ababil S, that carry high-quality photography and sensor equipment, and traditional combat drones, such as the Shahed 149 Gaza, that launches bombs from altitude. And all of the models that we just listed, and many more still to boot, are made indigenously, with absolutely no dependence upon strategic materials sourced from unfriendly nations. Exact and reliable figures for how much they cost and the amount they may have simply doesn't exist in open intelligence sources, so we're not going to bother to give you figures. But we will say this: compared to traditional manned airframes, they are an absolute steal and will cost barely a fraction of the price to get equivalent or at least somewhat compatible capabilities. So, by going balls to the wall with UAVs, Iran isn't exactly getting an air force to rival the United States, but they are getting serious bang for their buck, and once again, making the prospect of taking them on just a little bit more uncertain. Some commentators have been quick to dismiss the Iranian drone effort as a bit of a boondoggle, largely due to the April 2024 attack on Israel, during which around 170 of them were launched and a grand total of none actually made it to their target. And sure, at face value, this does look like the Ayatollah took a bit of an L, but consider it this way. A single arrow missile, the type Israel largely used to intercept them, costs $3.5 million per unit, with the whole attack costing Israel over $1 billion to see off, and you can probably see how the maths could be argued that it worked out in Iran's favor. Now, whilst we don't have solid production cost figures, this thing certainly didn't cost $3.5 million, did it? And that pretty much is our argument. Like we already said, it's not that we think Iran would actually beat Israel if the two nations were to go to war. We'd never be so bold as to make such concrete predictions and risk ourselves looking like monumental tits in the future. It's more an account that of all the good parts of their military we listed in this chapter, we simply think that they could surprise us with their performance, and you have to admit, we certainly aren't baseless in our thoughts, are we? Alright, now we do want to be fair in our analysis, and so it's only right that we take the time to address some of the very real issues the Iranian military has, because while we certainly think they could put a surprising effort in, the greatest fighting force on Earth, we absolutely do not think they are. And the first, and by far the most glaring issue of them all, is the age and condition of much of its equipment. As a veritable cornucopia of the most shiny and Gucciest gear, Iran is not. And for every one thing we saw in the last chapter that made us raise our collective eyebrows and say, ooh, that's a surprising bit of alright, isn't it? There's something else that has been outright neglected. For example, their Air Force operates a fleet of aircraft that include models such as the F-4 Phantom, T-5 Tiger II, and F-14 Tomcat. Designs that first took to the skies in 1960, 1964, and 1974 respectively. Leftovers from the pre-revolutionary days back when Iran and the US were best mates, those airframes are just not up to snuff for a scrap against Israel, which would be bringing things like brand new F-35s and recently tarted up F-15s to the fight. As for why the disparity exists in aircraft performance, here's the CliffsNotes version. Modern aerial combat is all about who has the longest range missiles and sensors, and whoever does gets his missiles off first and thus wins. And those old aircraft simply can't see or shoot as far. But that's not even the only problem with them, because with so much of its fleet being made up of American aircraft, and with America not exactly chomping at the bit to send them spare parts, actually keeping them in the sky only gets exponentially more difficult as time goes on. There have been efforts to set up alternative supply lines, of course, both domestically and overseas, but with that failing to produce parts in both the quantity and quality needed, the rate of mechanical failure and thus the degree of combat readiness of the fleet is reportedly getting shockingly bad. Do note, however, that this isn't an issue for all of Iran's aircraft, as they have absolutely no problems at all getting spares for their Chinese J-7s and Russian MiG-29s, but with them only having 30 and 24 of them respectively and suffering from the same exact performance disparity as Iran's old American aircraft, they aren't exactly what you call a formidable air arm. They were also working on a stealth fighter named the Qaher 313 that was intended to go toe-to-toe with the likes of the F-22 and the F-35, but after 10 years of work on it, and with very little to show for it besides one very dubious taxi run, it was announced in 2023 that it was going to be reworked into a posh UAV, with the first delivery deadline of mid-2024 having come and gone without being fulfilled, so we could pretty fairly assume it's not happening, at least not in any meaningful way. Alright, moving on from aircraft now to ground equipment, we can see that a similar situation exists, with the Iranians trying to do it properly and keep up with the big boys, but ultimately failing. Take tanks, for example. At present, their force is dominated by vehicles such as the Sam-Sam, a modernized American M60, the Mobarez, a modernized British Chieftain, and the Safir 74, a modernized Soviet T-72. Now, to be fair to the Iranians, this isn't quite as black and white a situation as it was with their air force, because, as has been shown in the still ongoing Russia-Ukrainian war, modernized old tanks can kinda still hold their own and be useful battlefield assets if, and it is a big if, they are deployed intelligently. But alas, the situation being not quite as terrible as it first appears still does not mean that it is a good situation, and so there's no two ways about it. When Israel would be bringing absolute units like the Merkava Mark IV into the fray, we wouldn't envy the folks in the Iranian tanks. Iran is trying to remedy the situation, however, with a solution that comes in the form of the Qarar, a shiny new model of tank that was first introduced back in 2020, and 800 of which have been ordered. Unfortunately, we know remarkably little about it, at least with any certainty, and so it's hard to form any concrete conclusions. We do know that it's based on the T-72, and that's about it. Some sources say that it's little more than a basic T-72 in a fancy frock, the rep-spec BMW with the M badges on the back. And others say that it's an absolutely belting bit of kit that comes packed with an electro-optical fire control system, a laser rangefinder, ballistic computer, and the ability to fire at both stationary and mobile targets in day or night. In other words, a tank that puts it on par with the Abrams or a Challenger 2. But we just can't say, and it would be disingenuous for us to come down on either side with the currently available information. And it's a good job that we had a look over today's script before making this video, because not even a day after the first draft was completed, this story dropped. TLDR version, they're now doing another tarted up version of their American M60s that they're calling the Solomon 402, and basically, we know bugger all about it at present, at least that we can absolutely be sure about, so we won't bother speculating on it, just know that it is a thing that now exists. It's also worth saying that the same situation that exists with Iran's tanks also exists with most of its ground equipment, i.e. it's not so bad that it'd be totally useless, and there are efforts to get some good stuff issued as and where able, but generally speaking, they just don't use the most cutting edge and top-of-the-line gear. Take helmets, for example. At face value, they use a modern Kevlar helmet just like any other cutting-edge military, one that unfortunately we were unable to find the actual name of despite spending way too long trying to do so. But while you'll see this helmet everywhere during military parades and during staged photo ops, it is far less common in candid photographs, with the old-fashioned steel M62 being far more dominant. So certainly they do have a fantastic helmet in production, but clearly they're just not producing them in enough volume to make them standard issue. And it's the same situation with small arms as well, as they have some good stuff like the AK-133, a license-produced modern Russian AK-103, and the Masov 2, which according to most commentators is an HK-416 copy of some kind. In reality, it appears that most of their military uses out-of-date and suboptimal firearms with licensed production German G3s and the KL, a family of indigenously adapted Chinese Type 56 AKs, instead being what it really uses, at least most of the time. Again, much like their tanks, these would certainly do the job. We don't want to give you the impression they'd be running into battle with pea shooters, as they absolutely wouldn't be, but cutting edge... No, not cutting edge. Then there's the issues with Iran's naval capabilities, because while parts of it, particularly the IRGC Navy that we mentioned in the last chapter, do indeed seem pretty handy, otherwise it's the same story yet again. That being that while it's not comedically by any stretch of the imagination, it's certainly lacking a certain luster. For example, it currently has 4 normal diesel-powered attack submarines in inventory and an estimated up to 23 mini-submarines. These are reasonably new, however, at least compared to the subs of some other countries, with the oldest of the lot being the IRIS Tarek, one of the 4 normal ones, which was commissioned back in 1992. So you can see what we mean. It's not terrible, but it's not exactly great. As for their surface fleet, again, it's alright at best. Take their frigates, for example. They currently have 7 of them, which range in age from 53 years old, as is the case with the IRIS Alvand, through to the brand spanking new IRIS Dayman, which was only commissioned in 2023. Typically, it's agreed that they have okay equipment, good enough to do the job, but by no means cutting edge. And we do stress the supposed nature of that statement, however, because while we have a reasonably good idea of their capabilities, as is the case with so much of the Iranian military, we ultimately just don't know for certain. What we do know, however, is that thanks to its limited number of combat hulls, no matter how good or bad they end up actually being, the Iranian Navy could well have real issues with power projection in a shooting war. But then again, the Israeli main surface fleet isn't exactly vast either, currently comprising only 7 corvettes and 8 missile boats. So, never say never, we guess? Now, ultimately, there is way more that we could talk about if we had the time today, but due to time constraints, we've had to boil our musings down only to the most pressing considerations. But we believe we've discussed enough to evidence our initial claims. That being that the Iranian military, for all of its flaws, probably shouldn't be written off as a comedy force that could be simply brushed aside Gulf War style. We are open to being wrong, however, as after all, there are few things quite as subjective as military analysis. So if you think differently, please let us know in the comments. Thanks for watching.